Thank you, Professor Ma. Thank you to EPA Taiwan and to ICHI for inviting me to speak with you on the U.S. and America's perspective on CCS's status and development. If I'm successful, I should be able to finish before midnight, my time. So you've heard a lot of the global status and the global roadmap that IEA has put out from Mr. Lippinen. I'm going to give you sort of the U.S. perspective, and they should be very consistent. Being consistent means there may be a little bit of repetition, but we all should be amazed and comforted by the fact that there is consistency around the world, especially in the U.S., which sometimes is not the case. What I'm going to do is to introduce this talk from the standpoint of the business case. And the reason I do that is because it will take industry to move CCS forward, because the governments cannot do that alone. The governments probably set the tone and the incentives to put the policies out there to do that, and any type of incentives relative to granting support. But to sustain CCS for the long term, we need industry participation and leadership in that, and that's the theme of this goal. So, presentation outline is that I'm going to talk about some of the challenges in making the business case for CCS and what's happening in North America from the policy and regulatory developments. And as Claire had already talked about, the importance of communications and outreach. And then I'm going to get into what is happening in the United States, primarily with the DOE program in partnership with industry in terms of capture, storage, and scale-up pilot demonstrations. And then give you some summary thoughts. You have heard a lot from Yuho about the capture and things in the roadmap that the IA's put out. So I'm going to try to get into a little bit more specifics about what's actually happening. And I'm going to tell you which slides that you need to pay attention to if you learn nothing else or remember anything else from what I say. Okay. So with that, this is the first slide I want you to remember, because this is the business case triangle, as we call it. And this is important because this is the interplay between technology development, the policies in the market, and the understanding and acceptance from not just the general public, but the financial community. And those things need to work together in harmony. They must be timed together in such a way that these things come together. I, being an engineer, like to look at things from the technology side. Those in the policy thinks that technology is okay, but it's policy that drives everything in the marketplace. Show me the money. Okay. But in truth, all of it has to work together. So I'm going to try to look at what are some of the challenges that allow us to bring this case together, and what is the government program and working with industry and other stakeholders is going to do for us. So with that, some of the key challenges to carbon capture and storage and utilization, if you will, I separate out into two categories. One being technical, which actually talks to the economics of it, and the other one are the legal and social issues about acceptance. First, you've heard capture technologies for the existing plant, the new plants in IGCC, and obviously the cost of CCS is an added cost. It's an added cost to bring down the emissions from coal plants, industry plants, gas plants as well. And then looking at what do we have in terms of storage capacity, which Ivo has already talked about, and there's a lot of storage capacity, the issue is developing it in a way that we can all use it, and establishing and improving CO2 storage permanence. I like to use the term stability because I don't live 1,000 years to prove that it's permanent, but at least we have a risk-based way of looking at this. And then when all this is put together, establish the best practices in storage sites, characterization, and looking at the monitoring, verification, and modeling. On the other side of the equation, we look at the legal and social issues in terms of the regulatory frameworks, which has been spoken of earlier. And I'm going to talk about a little bit of what's happening in the United States with the EPA. And also the legal framework in terms of ownership for space, and liability that goes beyond what the EPA can do. The investments in infrastructure that is needed, primarily in the injection, as well as in the transport of CO2. The human capital, and more importantly, again, the public acceptance, the not in my backyard, in this case, is not under my backyard if we're talking about CO2 storage. So with that, what are some of the challenges? We all know that CCS is capital intensive, and it comes with it an add-on of high energy penalty in terms of the technology that exists today. The cost of capture is higher than what the market price would yield for CO2, even in the case of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, if we don't have a carbon valuation policy, and we don't have one, by the way, in the United States at present. Now, in the U.S. and in Canada, we are blessed and cursed with one thing. It's called low prices of natural gas. Low prices of natural gas gives us energy security and hopefully lower cost of electricity, lower cost of energy for a lot of things. But it is also something that deters one from investing in CCS technology on coal plants, especially given the way the new plant regulations are that come out from the EPA. So as you've heard before, we need more incentives to build large-scale demonstrations so that we can gain that experience and reduce the cost. The legal and regulatory issues, like long-term liability and ownership rights, we need to frame that in a way that the industry can actually use it, understand it, and rely on it for the long term, not changing policies from one administration to the next. One of the good things about being retired from the federal government, I can speak a little more openly about these things. Of course, I could get fired too. So, some of the states and provinces like North Dakota, Wyoming, Texas, and Alberta have taken the lead in these issues, but this hasn't really happened on a national scale. So, the other one that I mentioned was the public understanding and acceptance of CCS is extremely critical in order for us to move CCS forward. We have to engage locally, early and critically, and put the value propositions in terms that local community can relate to. And I will repeat that message later on when I come to that one specific slide there. Okay, so when we talk about the business case, it's about this little house triangle down here. Because if you look at a power plant with CCS, look at the net present value in terms of billions of dollars. This is what we need in terms of revenues from our investment. This is the base plant capital investment. This is the add-on for the CO2. Here's the operating cost, depends on efficiency and the cost of the fuels, of course. And here is the operating penalty. So if you take this little green one and this little blue one, you will build a little house there, and that's the gap we need to close. That's the business case that we need to focus on. Okay? Very simple to explain, very difficult to achieve. Okay, here's something else that you should know. If we strip away all of the subsidies for renewables and everything else, and just take a look at the technology portfolio, the Institute has done a compilation of various studies that shows that, oops, excuse me, wrong button. Yeah, there we go. The little greenies here will show you that CO2 capture with coal and natural gas is right in the mix. So why not treat it equally with the rest of them in terms of looking at a decarbonization portfolio versus just a renewable standard portfolio? Something to think about. Okay? So, legal and regulatory. CO2 in the United States, we're looking for EOR. The industry says, this is a commodity, it has value, it is not a waste. The EPA says, well, if you're going to put it into the ground, we need you to do certain things because if you're going to leave it there, at some point in the future, we may have to consider that a waste. And this has been the ongoing tension between the industry and EPA. So the permitting for CO2 and EOR is very well known, very well matured. Industry is very comfortable with it. They understand what they're doing. But the underground injection control regulation for EPA, where CO2 for ER, which is what we classify as a class 2 injection, can be declared a waste storage under what we call class 6 after you finish the operations. And under this thing, the states themselves can apply for what we call primacy. They will take over the implementation program and they will handle that. For all of these things that EPA is putting out there in terms of injection, they do not have the authority to go beyond those regulations for long-term liability. Okay? So, if we take a look at the underground injection control and other regulations impact on CO2 ER financially and business-wise, the models that they have it may in fact turn out to be a deterrent for CO2 ER projects going forward if they're forced into class 6. I don't know, but it sure doesn't seem to help too much. So if the storage status is declared towards the end of the injection project, then the regional EPA director has the decision to make as to whether or not this becomes a storage project or business as usual. If I come up from underground, look at the emissions, EPA put out the final regulations for new power plants at 1,000 pounds, which is 454 grams per pound. 450 kilograms on megawatts per hour. I'm still old English this week. And that only affects coal power plants because on an advanced natural gas combined cycle, you don't have to do that. So the question is, you know, if I don't have to do that on gas, and gas is very cheap, who's going to invest in CCS on a coal plant? I don't know. So the next set of regulations that are going to come out, which EP has been very, very tight about, is the regulation on existing power plants. And that's due out next month, and we'll see. In Canada, the emissions are slightly more stringent in the U.S. for coal, on coal plants. And as you've already heard in more detail than I just mentioned here, Alberta has a regulatory framework in place that has been informed by multitudes of countries around the world. So, the current policy incentives framework in the United States are a set of tax credits. And for coal power, there is a 20% investment tax credit for IGCC, integrated gasification combined cycle power, and 15% for advanced gasification. And there's a production tax credit, $10 per ton for ER. We use short tons, by the way, in the United States, not the metric. And $20 per ton for straight storage, dedicated storage, but there is a limit of 75 million tons. So what is the problem? The problem is this. When you see a lot of the early movers, what is it? There are a lot of gas separation industrial technologies or maybe ethanol plants where CO2 removal is part of the process and they're going to do it anyways. Will they end up eating up the whole 75 million tons before a power plant gets to it? So there are movements afoot, and I'll talk about that, as to what some of the stakeholders in the industry think maybe some ways of moving forward without maybe costing the government a lot of money, if anything at all. So you've also heard that there are matching grants in the Clean Coal Power Initiative Awards, but we have not identified in the U.S. any new funding coming forward. There's a federal loan guarantee out there of $6 billion that have been allocated to coal projects with CCS and CCUS, as well as other efficiency plans, fossil and natural gas as well. And the loan guarantee will fund up to 80% of the total project cost. And in the action among the states, some of them provide more direct project support, such as the rate basing in Kemper in Mississippi, where you can, the added cost is built into what you can charge to customers. And the same thing was in Illinois with the FutureGen project. I've been with the FutureGen project when I was in DOE since its inception, from FutureGen 1 to FutureGen 2. I assure you hope this project makes it up because that's part of the legacy I left behind. But Texas seems to understand a lot of the issues associated with CCS and CCUS. Okay, so they have a broad portfolio of incentives in terms of storage, just like on these production tax credits on a national basis. And California, as you also know, has an emissions cap and trade at $10 per ton that will be tied to some escalation. It's not so clear whether CCS is going to be included in that. California loves the sunshine, they'll take all the power, but they don't want to look at carbon emissions. And they have a renewable portfolio of 30% of their power, electricity, emissions by 2020. There is a project called Hydrogen Energy of California, which is an IGCC/Polygen plant with CCS that's in the design phase, so we'll see how that plays out. In Canada, there is no national regulation on GEC on greenhouse gas emissions yet, but they've also combined and teamed with some of the provinces to provide the incentives, such as projects in Boundary Dam and Alberta, Crest, and everything. Alberta has this $15 Canadian tax, which, when collected, is plowed back into R&D for low emissions and research and reducing costs of CCS projects, primarily because of oil sands. And the Quest project, Northwest Red Water upgrade projects are primarily a way of looking at ways to capture CO2 from upgrading the oil sands there. And of course, you've heard from Claire on the Boundary Dam CCS project. So, here's some things that some of the stakeholders in the United States have been thinking about. CO2 in the US and also in Canada, we look at this as a key enabler for CCS deployment because we don't have a national carbon valuation. And without enough CO2, the oil that's stuck into the ground that we can get out, we would not be able to get. So the idea here is this. If you could front me the money to put on the investments for carbon capture so that the CO2 is there and is produced for EOR in the United States, when the production of oil comes with it revenues, taxes, and royalties to the federal government. So over time, the government will get paid back to the point that maybe after 10 years, the government starts making money off of this. So that's the revenue neutrality aspect of this. There's also another idea by a group called the third way, that if we're going to be exporting fossil fuels, perhaps they don't call it a tax, perhaps we do a fee on the export so that money is collected in such a way that it can be put towards subsidizing carbon capture demonstrations from the first, second, and third generation. Okay? I actually like the idea of the UK contract for differences, but it would be wonderful if we could put all of these pieces together and make something work. So, to repeat, the policies, the regulations, the technology, and market acceptance, because we want to bring the financial capital off the sidelines, they must align in order for the projects to have the incentives to make an impact, to go beyond these first movers, as we talked about, as you heard about earlier. So, now into the communication and public engagement, and Claire went through immense details about all the nuances. I just have one simple question that you need to answer if you're going to put a project in somebody's backyard. Write this down. What's in it for me? If you cannot answer the question, what's in it for me, that project is not going to go there. Okay? So that's the first and foremost thing. All these other things is logic. Trust, trust, and trust. Just like in Chicago, vote early, vote often. You got to get out there to be early, honest, and open, and you have to continually engage with the locals through these various venues that Claire had talked about as well. And the showing the value and the benefits of the project is a way of answering what's in it for me in terms of jobs, the compensation that you can pay people to have these access rights, the economic growth opportunities that is brought in because I'm bringing the project to turn the economy. But one piece that folks don't realize is that on a state level, regional level, if it happens that there is international regulations and targets, and you don't have the CCS technology in place, your fossil assets could be stranded, meaning that you can't produce it, to use it anywhere. So that's something for the long term for people to distinguish and to actually look at it for the long term in terms of its value proposition. And that's important to provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan. If I can't export my oil sands because I don't have the technology to show that it's a lower carbon footprint than where I am. They're very keen about that, amongst other things, okay? So, engage the general public and get the facts out. CCS is not a subsidy for fossil. How can it be a subsidy if it's going to cost you more money to do, okay? We have to dispel notions of misinformation. We have to put everything in context and answer questions like seismicity that we're going to hear from later on in the panel, okay? And you need to engage all stakeholders in terms of including environmental groups. One thing that Claire didn't put in her slide, I'll add to, one of the more credible groups that can carry your water or to carry your message are the environmentalists, who are sane, not the extremes, that understand in the bigger picture, we're trying to solve a climate issue. And if these other little things we can handle with technology and the proper research work to address all these other issues, they're not showstoppers. They just require work and they require detailed analysis and evaluation, mostly geologically. So, those are all the problems I laid out. What is going on and how are we to address that? So, the best way to do that is to tell you what is the DOE program strategy for CCS R&D and demonstration. And this is the second slide I want you to mark in your book. It's very detailed, but it's a very simple flow. I start with the core R&D. For those things that show promise, I take it into the various stages of pilot. For those that look like they're promising for a pilot in the large scale. I take it a demonstration. I engage that learning with international projects, which is extremely important. It's for us to accelerate CCS learning, feed that back through the R&D so that I know how to reduce on the operations, as well as how I can integrate those operations into the next generation and what we call transformational capture technologies, and looking at smarter ways of being able to characterize and monitor our geologic site. Because as was pointed out, we can move technology and the components for capture around, we can't really move the sites, okay? And you'll see the various benefits about reducing costs, developing cool tools for risk assessment and mitigation, but also in terms of scaling, and then finally getting to the knowledge building, international collaboration, and modeling that we need to do to build the commercial deployment case. So, looking at the capture piece of it, there are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of combinations and compounds for that can take CO2 up. The question is, how do we go about screening it? There's one technique based on first principles. It's called the molecular density function. Okay, and then you add to that the screening of, is it low-cost material that I'm going to be using? Is the uptake fast? Does it have a low regeneration energy and separation technology? Can it withstand the environment in which it's going to have to operate? And is it environmentally tolerant? And by the way, environmentally benign, such as it doesn't emit certain things into the atmosphere that would cause a different type of a problem. So we take those ideas, screen them down, and see what makes sense at the bench scale. We test that, research it, and then we move up to the technology readiness level at the pilot scale, such as those tested in the U.S. at the National Carbon Capture Center, which is part of a whole group of international test facilities that PCM and Mondstadt has organized. Once I do that, even at the large scale, I said, it looks good. But now I've got to take a look at what is the system design studies in integration for its scale-up potential, because things don't normally replicate themselves at the small scale. There are risks as you go up, and utilities and other industries are fairly conservative about what those scale-up factors are. So if it passes all of that, money aside, then technically speaking, that this technology is ready for full-scale CCS demonstration. Now, looking at the storage side, the storage is really risk-based. And the things that are important is to look at it by putting together a partnership that can assess the risk of storage from the national laboratories and working with industry. And site characterization is important because unlike EOR operations where people have been there for 30, 40, 50 years and know those sites extremely well, if we're going into saline reservoirs for storage, we don't know a whole lot about that. And it takes a long lead time, somewhere between 5 to 10 years to get to a certain characterization. And you have to do that because you don't want surprises on any front. And all of these things have to be put into a best practices manner that is constantly being updated, and that's being through the regional carbon sequestration partnerships, which I also get into in the next few slides here as well. So this is what I affectionately call the Sally Benson curve from Stanford. Okay, but we put a little more to it. And that risk profile in injection is primarily related to the pressure that I have to put into the ground. Okay, because if I'm in a storage formation, there's a certain pressure, now I have to increase the pressure to move some of the water out of the pore space for the CO2 to take place. And Hugo also talked about the various trapping mechanisms that can reduce that risk. But over the long term, as I finish my operations of injection, that risk drops, the plume dissipates a little bit larger, and then I've done my modeling to see how well I predicted the movement and shape of that, just like in SAW. And then over the long term, we take a look at, how stable is this from modeling and risk assessment. So I talked about the National Risk Assessment Partnership. This is a partnership that DOE leads from the national laboratories and also with stakeholder groups that have an interest in looking at CO2 storage. Okay, and basically, if we build this risk model, these will become the tools I will use to assess storage risk for the long term. None of us is going to live for 1,000 years, even if we wanted to. So we need to be able to try to have some predictability with certain uncertainty bands at some manageable and acceptable risk. So I talked about the fact that we need sites. As part of the stimulus package in the United States, when I was still at DOE, we devoted about $50 million for 10 sites. And you'll notice here that there are 2 sites that are offshore in the Gulf of Mexico and off of Los Angeles in California. So this is just to get them started, just to get the initial assessment, so that we have this as a baseline so that if anyone wants to go to these regions to develop the case of an integrated CCS project, they will have a start to do the next phase and the next phase after that for the detailed characterization on projects. I talked about the regional carbon sequestration partnerships, and they're developing the infrastructure for the wide-scale deployment. As you also said, the geologies are local, and as Maud says, it's sort of a global localization, if you will. So they've gone through several phases of injection, and the last phase is in terms of the development phase that will be developed and completed by 2018. This all goes into developing the best practices manual, which actually informs how standards will be written. Standards are very important for a very simple reason, because this is true whether it's for storage or for a power plant or for any industry plant. In order for you to get permitted, you have to have insurance. In order for you to get insurance, the insurance companies have to rely on what standards are you using. So this is why standards are important. It gives the industry consensus as to why and how you did something that is acceptable by the broad industry. So when we put all this together, the knowledge sharing products is what comes out of this, including the storage capacity in North America. I think you had also alluded to that. And we talk about this piece in here, training. We need a workforce in the future that will allow us to do that. If we don't have sufficient workforces, that means labor control and the price of the project goes up because labor goes up. And as I mentioned before, the best practices help us inform standards into the future. Okay, I've done the R&D on capture, and I've done the R&D on storage. I didn't mention anything about transport because the United States transport is very well known. It's done by the Interstate Organization of the IOGCC, Oil and Gas Compact Commission. There are standards out there. We move CO2 all the time. There's like almost 4,000 miles. Calculate that in kilometers. It's a lot of kilometers. Okay, so they know how to do it. Kinder Morgan is in that business. They know what the purity of the CO2 has to be so that we don't create corrosion, stress corrosion in the pipelines because of carbonic acid, because of water's in the place and everything. So I talked about having done all the R&D now, it's time to, it's a show time for validating the technology at pilot scale and then moving from there to a demonstration. And these are the key steps for deployment of the technology. Here you see the Quest project, which is under construction, Boundary Dam under construction, which is, I think, soon to go operational, finishing sometime later this fall. I mentioned TCM Norway because they are one of the, I think it is the largest test facility out there for CCS, and they're part of an international network of test facilities around the world, which includes in the U.S. the National Carbon Capture Center in Wilsonville, Alabama, that is run by several companies, which is the one in the lower left-hand corner here. Okay. There's a plant Berry, which is a slipstream, I think it's about 25 megawatts. It basically captures the CO2 and puts it into a deep-setting reservoir. And of course, the Kemper County. This is a photo shot of the development under construction. It's a little bit dated. They are also going to be ready sometime later on this year to start up in terms of operations. It's a huge, huge project in terms of physical size. So, why didn't that not come through? Oh, it's one of these things. I didn't know I had that. All right, we've got DOE-funded CCS demonstration projects. There's 10 of them. And I think if I calculate it correctly, here's a table. If I calculate it correctly, the DOE's investments in large-scale projects is over $3 billion, but that's leveraging, I think, something like $20 billion of projects amongst those 10. And here you'll see all but 2 of them are EOR, only the arthrodamnids, which is basically an ethanol plant in Illinois, and the Fujigen, which also is in Illinois, are saline storage. Okay? You have all that in your slides there. So, very good. Summary thoughts. Fuel switching, even though we have low-price gas and EOR, is not enough to meet global standards, global targets from the United States standpoint. Okay? We put out almost 6 billion tons a year, and from the coal plants is about just under 1.8 or something like that, 1.7 billion tons. Because UHO showed you that's wedge slide. Fuel switching is only 2%. So how can you get there with fuel switching with natural gas? And not everybody has cheap natural gas to do that. So absent any carbon legislation, maybe just the regulations where we have carrot and stick. Carrot or incentive, stick is regulations. Maybe that's not enough to encourage further investments in CCS and CCS. So you need, as I mentioned before, the technology, the policy incentives, the regulations to work in harmony to send the markets the signals, as so long as you're doing your public engagement properly. Okay. We need to include CCS as part of this decarbonizing or clean technology portfolios so that it gets those equitable incentives that maybe the renewables portfolio is giving. Maybe we should just call it a decarbonization portfolio and let everybody see what the market is going to accept. We also need to share knowledge going forward for a couple of reasons. It's not only to accelerate things, but because we are in the early stages, we cannot afford a misstep in a project coming after the project that you've gone through and allow a mistake to happen, because that setback could be devastating. So that's why it's important for us to do that. But on a broader thing, I think the IEA had this number. I think 70% of the energy demand to 2050 is going to come from developing countries. And if the world is relying on 80% or more of its energy sources from fossil fuels, you can do the math. That's why it's important to give an option, not an option, let's say, but the technology, the essential technologies to the developing economies so that they can adopt in an affordable way technology, allow them to use their indigenous fuels so that it doesn't get stranded as an asset. With that, I'm going to stop and take the questions you might have. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.